The limitations of negative health paradigms, anti-stress, anti-aging, for a positive critique, an audio essay. In the 1930s, a series of experiments was conducted by Hans Selye on the stress response and its chronic effects on rat tissues. Since then, stress and its molecular attendants have been topics of biomedical research. Elsewhere, phrases such as being stressed out demonstrate this concept's reception in popular culture. Where the scientific and the popular here meet is in stress-reducing practices, such as meditation, the contrarian concept of hormesis, and, most recently, an anti-stress ideology based on the ideas of Ray Peat. Put simply, Peat recommends providing the body with consistent nutrition, avoiding environmental stressors like cold exposure, and limiting intense physical exercise. These ideas and the practices derived from them are often referred to as pro-metabolic or generative energy. Peat makes use of generally accepted markers of stress, such as adrenal hormone release and drop in body temperature. These responses occur during starvation, fight or flight, and chronically in aging, as per Selye et al. Fasting, cold exposure, and overexertion produce similar responses, albeit on a smaller scale, and are therefore to be avoided. Peat's ideas don't stop there, however. In an expansive philosophical style, he makes stress and stress molecules the villains of physiology. A kind of ascension is hinted at through eliminating stress and providing ideal conditions for the cells of the body. Unsurprisingly, these ideas have been expressed at times by followers as orthorexic behaviors. I have personally been asked troubled or frantic questions about whether a food is safe or not, and what I would do if I only had access to this kind of food versus some ideal version. Anecdotes aside, the ontology of anti-stress or anti-anything paradigms should be analyzed. This is not an argument against taking measures to reduce stress or promote longevity, but rather about negation of stress, aging, or anything being the philosophical foundation and practical expression of a health ideology. As I explain in the audio essay Constitutive Hegelianism of Diet, health ideologies express in purity spiraling dialectics, and in this, the anti-stress, anti-aging paradigms are no different. Anti-stress purity spiraling flows as naturally from these ideas as zero-carb flows from the idea that postprandial insulinemia may be harmful. Where they are different, however, as pure linguistic negations, is philosophically interesting in its own right. The purpose of life, as best as one can gather from Peat himself, is to preserve a high metabolic rate and childlike creativity, to oppose slowing of the metabolism and hardening of the personality. The reproductive life cycle, that of birth, maturation, breeding, and eventual death, is not in those terms much discussed. The purpose of the gonadal steroids, for example, is for maintenance of cellular structure and energy production, not fertility. Maturation, both physical and behavioral, is to be avoided in a permanent Peter Pan adolescence of metabolism and mindset. Authority, such as the parent or the doctor, is an antagonist to the organism's free expression, a social corollary to physical aging. The instincts of children are better guides than authority. Women, says Peat, are physiologically superior to men because they produce, not babies, but progesterone. Children are not something to be made, but rather something to be emulated. Further expounding on biology, Peat suggests that higher life emerges from lower solely due to abundant energy access. Resource abundance is the antithesis of stress, allowing for and promoting growth and development, whereas scarce resources, or the presence of stress, oppose it. Is life, complex in particular, truly a demiurge of the free and easy? Referencing Selye, Peat writes that a healthy organism meets a challenge with a quick and limited stress response, and that prolonged stress wears down this response ability. Indeed, Selye's chronically stressed animals often died. Imagine, however, an organic past where stressors never overcame any organismal response system. What would be the impetus for change? One experiment to measure stress is the elevated T maze, where a rodent is placed on a crossed beam platform with one walled and one open beam. An anxious rodent will spend all of their time on the walled beam, while a less anxious one will explore the open. This is a useful tool for determining stress in an experimental animal, but in the wild there are very good reasons for rodents to be apprehensive of exposure. Would you tell a prey animal, in danger from the land and the sky, that they need to decrease their stress about running in the open? Is there a place for predators in a stress-free world? What might this world look like? What might stress-free life be? I recall a biochemistry lecture on a classic experiment looking at the cellular response to total resource abundance. This experiment demonstrated that, when provided with every resource in excess, cells progressively jettison the genes needed for obtaining them from the environment. A smaller genome with less nucleotides to copy during replication gives a competitive advantage via shorter generation time. Cells bogged down by hundreds of genes they don't need, but still must copy for replication, will steadily lose out to cells more rapidly replicating a leaner genome. The cells eventually lost all of their genes as, ultimately, all genes are for obtaining resources, or for making things that, perhaps several degrees removed, function to obtain resources. After many generations, the resulting population will have preserved only the gene for DNA polymerase, the protein that copies DNA, the sum total of their life activity being reduced to copying the gene for the protein that copies genes. These polymerase life forms, these beautiful ones, have had stress and strife abolished from their existence. Alternately, a number of studies using single-celled algae showed that clumping, an hypothesized first step towards multicellularity, can develop in response to predation pressure. Algal cells with the propensity to irreversibly join others become too large for predators, and after enough generations, most of the originally free-living algae express this clumping phenotype. Heritably stable pseudo-colonies were produced by Boras et al. In 1998, and a similar result was shown by Becks et al. In 2010 with palmolloid production in green algae. Ratcliffe et al. In 2012 demonstrated the tendency to form multicellular units in yeast from the selective pressure of settling out, or quickly falling to the bottom of a media culture, another selection for clustering. Some of the cells in these clusters underwent apoptosis or contributed metabolically to the colony's reproduction but did not reproduce themselves, suggesting the beginning of a proto-germline phenotype, a cohesive but asymmetrically reproductive multicellular body. The latest in this vein of research, by Heron et al. In 2019, showed the same thing in unicellular algae under predation pressure from a paramecium. These changes were, as before, heritably stable, meaning that when the clumping populations were grown without the predator present, they continued to express the clumping phenotype for many generations. These experiments do not prove that predation pressure is the cause of higher life, nor could they. Sufficient resources are also, by definition, necessary, as any organism attempting to live beyond available means would price itself out of existence. Rather, they suggest that, in addition to resources, a spark of environmental stimulus sets the species down a path of complexity relative to the path it would have taken. This stimulus must be, or at the very least can be, a stressful one, communicating the need to develop tools for surviving in an uncooperative environment. If, on the other hand, the provision of ample resources was sufficient for the development of complexity, this should be easy to demonstrate experimentally. The confederation of anti-aging practices known as biohacking emerge from a similar ontology. This seems counterintuitive since in practice there can be quite a difference. While Pete preaches avoidance of stress, someone like Dave Asprey makes a hormesis argument that measured doses of certain kinds of stress are in fact anti-aging. Where Pete sees stress avoidance from consistent carbohydrate consumption, Asprey sees harm from chronic insulinemia. Where Pete sees stress from fasting, Asprey sees autophagy and the activation of so-called longevity genes. The differences are significant in practice, but are philosophically superficial. They are disagreements over the correct path to the same goal, that goal being the avoidance of aging and achieving the greatest possible extension of lifespan. Longevity practices have been around since antiquity. Then, as now, they were often practiced and taught by a priestly class. This is also the sector of society most likely to practice celibacy. The desire for longevity comes as no mystery. It is an expression of the survival instinct. In reproductive beings, survival instinct finds expression as the drive towards reproduction and, through abstract thought, the fear of death. Addressing this fear, Thanatophobia, and providing means for transcending it, is the responsibility of the society's religious and cultural institutions. In the ancient and classical worlds, naturalistic religions provided a means of transcendence by connecting individuals across time through the veneration of tribal lineage. Ancestors were worshipped as progenitor gods. This connection to the future as well as the past allowed the individual to transcend the fear of their own death as their spirit persisted through other members of the tribe. Religion and mythology supported seemingly irrational self-sacrifice, such as on the battlefield where immortality could be achieved through heroic deeds for the natio. Examples of this include Viking Valhalla and Greek and Roman myths involving heroism and the underworld. This means of collective transcendence was ended on the cross at Golgotha, where the concept of immortality shifted from tribal lineage to personal soul. This change came with new priestly practices, focusing on the soul rather than the body. Fasting, celibacy, and even self-harm, anything to deny the body, was performed by the most devout in an attempt to render the soul, their vehicle for immortality, pleasing to God. Thus the body and filial nature were no longer a focus of religion in the medieval and modern eras, but were only tenuously connected with ad hoc constructs. During these periods, Thanatophobia was addressed through the promise of the soul's everlasting life upon the demise of the flesh. In our postmodern world, the scientific worldview has ushered in an epoch of dominant materialism, what Nietzsche called the death of God, or, in the words of Spengler, Faustian man selling his soul for technics. Predictably, a materialist worldview resulted in the proliferation and sacralization of material solutions, some at the cutting edge of science, others hearkening back to ancient practices. Often, the two are combined by sophisticated and sensitive biohackers. From Dave Asprey's claim of a 180-year lifespan through the truly transhuman promises of distant science, a situation has emerged where bodily death appears to be, for the first time, in question. In the classical world, it was thought bad to die dishonorably. In the medieval and modern worlds, it was thought bad to die with a soul unsaved. And now, in our postmodern world, is it not thought bad to die? Thus, postmodern materialism mistakes battling Thanatos for transcending Thanatophobia, and, in so doing, releases the most pernicious death fear upon the world. Negative ideological frameworks, when applied to something like longevity, produce in short order a transition from the master morality of to live to the slave morality of to not die, a goal which, by means of static material condition, might be laid claim to by a rock as much as by a god. With no immortal people and no immortal soul, the priest preaches immortality through the preservation of the body. To repeat, this is not to say that reducing stress or living in such a way that slows aging is at all a bad thing, but rather that should the goal of avoiding stress or mortality become a priority in life, a dark path will have been embarked upon. Dave Asprey's goal of living to 180 employs many devices, as well as somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 daily supplements towards it. He seems to spend all of his time researching, discussing, and implementing longevity practices. He has made his primary purpose in life the extension of his life, pumping the money he earns selling longevity hacks back into his own longevity. Dave Asprey is a human version of the DNA polymerase cells. He has whittled down his life activity to the preservation and extension of his lifespan, living so that he may continue to live. At least someone like Paul Saladino, who in many ways is much more of a joke, spends his time surfing and ranting shirtless in grocery stores. Dave Asprey's idea of living is simply not dying. Does he avoid dangerous neighborhoods, large gatherings, busy intersections? Imagine how embarrassing it would be for him to die an untimely death. Consider the flower. Stress is involved in the flowering of plants. Through maturation or by external input, such as pruning, inflorescence is induced by chemical signals from changes in salicylic acid, ammonia metabolism, etc. This is also the case in seed and fruit production, and in the animal world, a rough analog is seen in puberty. It is well established that the lifespan of animals can be extended, often quite long depending on the species, from castration. Animal maturation involves many processes and molecules related to stress, echoing a pattern from the simplest organisms. The physiological signature of an imminently dividing bacterium is akin to a stressed state, with bulk water increasing and cellular machinery breaking down. In a sense, the progenitor cell does die, engaging in a process not unlike apoptosis, but with demolition controlled in such a way as to result in the formation of two new cells. The plant, the animal, and the microbe could all live longer if they did not produce their flowers and fruits, their gametes, or their daughter cells. The individual could live longer, that is, not the species. The extension of individual life instances by foregoing maturation and reproduction comes at the cost of not only the species, but of the individual's flowering, of its most vivid expression of becoming. The relationship between development and death, growth and aging can be seen at the molecular level. A much-discussed protein, mTOR, fully mammalian target of rapamycin, provides an example. Briefly, mTOR is a cellular switch that stimulates growth and proliferation. If a tissue is growing, then the mTOR pathway is there active. It is also, however, associated with aging and correlates with the rate of senescence. Certain nutrients have been found to stimulate mTOR, such as the sulfur-containing amino acid methionine. A methionine restriction is a longevity strategy. In stark relief, a central growth pathway is at the same time one of aging. With this in mind, the goal of those seeking extreme longevity is nothing less than the decoupling of growth and aging, the severing of an ancient biological yoke, a sort of trans-organic postulate. Can a thing be said to be alive if it loses the ability to die? Is death any more a thing to overcome than is birth? The extreme practice of anti-stress and anti-aging health ideologies, and they encourage extreme practice, is a religious one, based on materialism, taught by a priest class, and addressing the death fear. Far from being life-affirming, the more one delves into them, the more life-denying they become, the more one encounters do not instead of do. Living longer and healthier to do X embodies a powerful linguistic distinction from living longer per se. Just as institutions formed for some social purpose tend to morph into self-perpetuation machines, so too with an unchecked longevity goal. If Dave Asprey could be immortal, but he had to spend all of his time maintaining his immortality, would he do it? Is such an existence anything other than the rankest form of slavery? Is he, in fact, not moving in that direction already, selling his soul, so to speak, for the promise of everlasting life through technics? What a sick, sad Faust this age has wrought. One should seek to reduce stress in their activities, not reduce their activities for fear of stress. Should seek health and longevity to accomplish more in life, not make their life goals health and longevity. This is at the heart of the problem with negative paradigms. By negating a bad rather than confirming a good, there is an endless spiraling down, never a lifting up. Linguistically, anti-stress ought to be relegated the status of an adverb, modifying a more meaningful action. To act implies the desire to change a condition state, implying stress. Action encounters resistance. Acting to prevent stress is nearly a contradiction in terms, because the least stressful action one can engage in is inaction. The ultimate stress-free state is an inactive, bubble boy-esque one, in which homeostasis relaxes to stasis. As verbs, anti-stress and anti-aging are nihilistic and wearisome injunctions to life, mystical paths to nothingness. And, like religions come before, who attempted to extend one's tomorrows to the last syllable of recorded time, yesterdays that darkened fools the way to dusty life. On, eternal candle, but light not lest you be consumed by your fire. Eternity is but a standing shadow, a still player, that struts not and frets not in his eternity on the stage, but is never heard. It is a tale told by an idiot. No sound, no fury, signifying nothing.
You know, whatever. You do what you like to do, I do what I like to do, okay? But you're a sucker. You're getting fed this line about how, like, you're gonna live forever or whatever. You're gonna die. Someone will kill you. Someone will kill you with a knife.